Yes, David, then.
I can entirely endorse what you said earlier, Christian, about the idea of social democracy as sacred on the basis of all the people who died for it. My children of various ages are taught history at school, and I imagine probably 80% of what they learn is about Nazi Germany and the Second World War. There is an enormous focus on the sacrifice and the loss sustained by the social democracies in fighting the Nazis in particular. And that, I don't know how long they can continue to play that card, but they are playing it for all it's worth. I don't know whether it's self-conscious or what, but it's striking how much time and resource and effort is devoted to that and to commemorating what were genocides, but one wonders what the motive is in the commemoration of those genocides. And I think there is some truth in what you say. It's democracy came about because of all the deaths of all these brave people. How can you possibly challenge it?
Absolutely, and it is when, for instance, I tell people that I don't vote as a matter of principle because I'm not a Democrat and I'm against voting and so on, and every other person says, we've battled for so long in order to get the right to vote. How come you don't vote? It's like outrageous that you.
Over time, there's always been a class of people who try to keep power. It's true that today one realizes that the administration is not doing such a good job and they may want to change. But what makes you think they want the next society to be without a state? There might be another class of people who take power. For example, a couple of years ago, even last year in France, there was a very strong suggestion that employees of large companies get a third of the profit, and the rest would be shared between investors and shareholders. That, to my mind, was very much a way to create a class of people who would have no responsibility to the loss that the company might do, but would have the benefit without any, responsibility in return. And that would have created a class of people who would have been, living out of other people, and very much what we could call a new ruling class. So how do you see that we wouldn't have in the future a new ruling class that could be anybody?
Well, I think that you can have such a sort of proposal if you have a state with a monopoly of violence, physical violence and so on, to impose it. I mean, it could be that in a company, the shareholders decide that they will sort of allocate 30% of the profits to the staff, and many companies do this. But that is perfectly legitimate. It's one way of managing the company, of keeping staff loyalty and so on. When you have a state that imposes this on every company in the country, first of all, they can only do it on the territory, so it puts companies in the territory maybe at a disadvantage to other companies and so on. But more importantly, what is the legitimacy of this? Who is going to be, in the absence of a state, in the absence of a sacred state?
Who tells you there'll be no more states? There might be still a state, that's my point.
Well,
a different class of...
No, I mean, a different class. It could be what? Soviet state. I mean, class of... But it's still a state. It's still a ruling class. I mean, read, Trotsky's analysis of, the Soviet Union in the 1930s. He always says, state bureaucracy has become the new ruling class. It has replaced capitalism, and that was perfectly valid analysis for which he was killed. But so what I'm trying to say is that there will no longer be the physical possibility of establishing this monopoly of violence over the given territory, simply because of networks and the difficulty of imposing something on a certain territory without that moving about and so on.
Can I rephrase my question? We had a ruling class that was ruling Now we have a ruling class because of bureaucracy, the other one running the country. Well, what is the next ruling class? It could be something else. It doesn't mean there will be no more ruling class.
Well, what you are saying is that there will always be a state. In other words, the state is part of human society, like the queen is part of a bee society, you know, beehive or something like that. I don't think so. I mean, I think the state emerged sort of, you know, a few thousand years ago, and the modern state emerged in, you know, more or less at the time of the Renaissance. It is historically dated, and I think we are moving to something that is no longer the state as we've known it since, you know, the Renaissance.
Chap from South Political Society. What's your name, by the way?
Ian, I know we had it on.
Ian.
Didn't comment over. Right, Chris, variation on the theme which I've hit you with several times before, that's technology. The thing you were saying about Marx, that technology both enables and limits the state's power, but it's not clear to me that technology would have reached the intensity that it has done without the modern state, because networks need to be established, as you say, such as world railway networks. The national grid, for instance, it seems to me highly unlikely that without the monolithic downward supervision of the state, you'd have had a national grid in which the various electrical components would actually talk to each other. We see what happened to the Wild West, so the cowboy enterprise culture of IT, in which you have to be an expert in all sorts of alternative software and alternative linking systems to make your computer talk to your projector and talk to another computer. Finally, you can't run a program on one computer, you can another because it needs some other translation package, and so on. It's kind of messy again when you get private enterprise unlimited, where you have individual entrepreneurs calling the tune, which is not the advantage of the consumer. Was when the state uses some standard like the width of screw fed, or you know, standard sort of 430,000 volt power cables, then at least you know what's going to happen. Everyone's going to conform to that standard. And having decided to conform, they're actually liberated by the fact that they don't have to learn again and again someone else's protocol. So there's a certain advantage in having a state monopoly on the provision of or the enablement of technology. Would you agree with that?
No, well, where I agree with you is that certainly the state was a progress. The state was a progress from the kind of situation that we had before, in many different ways, and in other ways it was, you know, a regress. But the exactly actually, as you know, even in, you know, the eyes of Marx, capitalism was a great progress, a great improvement on, you know,
on feudalism,
over feudalism and so on. And so I'm not saying, you know, that everything the state has done is bad or everything the state is doing today is bad. What I'm saying is that there probably the negatives are outweighing the positives. In other words, of course, you know, the burden of the state, the weight of the state, is now no longer warranted, and people are sort of discovering this. Now, in terms of, you know, creating protocols and things like this, yes, the many things probably would not have happened if the state has not paid for them and so on. Certain technological advances, for instance, came from, you know, war efforts and so on. But you know, is it because of this that we cannot quantify? We cannot say, you know, without this, without the state, this would not have happened. There are a few things that, you know, probably without the state, atomic bombs would have never been developed. But, you know, except for a few things like this, where it is obvious that without the state, this would have happened. The rest you can't say. It would have happened 10 years later, it would have happened before, it would have been stifled, it would have been fostered. You cannot tell.
What do you think national electrical, I mean, obviously, maybe railways originally were separate railway companies, but at least they were standardized within a territory.
Exactly, and the state didn't decide this. I mean, it's railway companies who, you know, the managers of railways said, well, we better have the same gauge, because otherwise we can't interconnect. So our railway will be useless if it cannot sort of continue to, and so on.